A huge thank you to Square Enix who have provided the game for review purposes. Oninaki is a game about death, specifically the death of hundreds and hundreds of your friends, enemies, and everyone in between. As someone who has played the past 2 games in the series from the Tokyo RPG Factory and who enjoyed the more serious and daunting themes of I Am Setsuna, I was delighted to see what they could do with this interesting veil shifting mechanic. Well, let's find out. The narrative delivery of Oninaki is unusual at times and borderline genius at others. Playing as Kagachi, you fall into the role of a watcher. These guardians of the spirit realm are able to traverse the thin veil between life and death, specifically with an aim of helping those who have died accept their fates and move on. For if they do not, then they will not be able to move on and be reincarnated to the next life. There are some great moments in the story early on, with a few key ones really emphasizing the storytelling potential of this form of media. Unfortunately, there are some pacing issues that cause more jarring events to seemingly just drop out of nowhere, not having the intended emotional impact, such as key deaths being accompanied with very little to no build-up, and you're left unsure how to feel as you hadn't really developed the necessary attachments and are instead just expected to grieve for them. It's not always the case. The standout characterization and relationship is between Kagachi and Lin, a mysterious young girl who greets him early in the adventure. You aren't entirely sure who or what she is, but the timeless and very smart choice of the little sister role she takes on will be instantly familiar to many. The dialogue between these 2 characters is perhaps some of the strongest in the game. I would describe the overall narrative as slightly flawed but with flashes of excellence. I can't understandably go into lots of detail, but there's a touch of everything in here. Life, death, relationships, betrayal, despair, as well as a plethora of NPC deceased which can be optionally aided to move them on. The part of the story I adored though were the tales of your demon. These are the souls of the warriors you absorb along the way, and the more they level, the more you can learn about their past and how they became deceased. This was a great idea, but again, it left me longing for full motion video cutscenes or even animations to depict these epic tales being told. Still, I enjoyed them and they made leveling much more compelling. Is it a story worth telling, you ask? Well, yes, I guess so. I would just say some of the deeper underpinnings weren't as impactful as they could or indeed should have been. So many characters pass that you numb to it entirely, which interestingly could well have been a part of the narrative itself. I felt some of the impact was lost down to some of the musical direction choices. Overall for me, story scores 14 out of 20. You control Kagachi in the typical third-person style, with the camera at a fixed height above him, which is changeable from the options menu but not on the fly. And even so, I would have liked to have been able to pan out even further. Dialogue is mainly on-screen text, with quite a few Japanese voiceovers taking place. Much of the melee uses the demon system, which is this. Throughout your adventure, you'll find the souls of fallen demon and be able to absorb them into yourself. They essentially act as your weapons, but are characters all of their own. These are leveled up by using them in combat, which grants you points to spend within their soul tree, granting them a unique set of skills and unlocks, some of which will affect the entire party. Leveling is swift, and while your base character level raises, it's that ongoing and constant leveling of the demons you choose to use that became the most compelling aspect. The next area is the combat, and while some identified this as quite simple in the demo, they would be both right and quite wrong. Setting up your party, as I mentioned, involves choosing up to 4 of these demons, which are quick switchable on the fly during combat using the right analog stick. This mechanic is a delight, and it meant, for example, if you were fighting a larger enemy, you might use a demon with a quick dodge, whittling them down and then shift to a ranged character and deliver a devastating area of effect to clear the smaller enemies on the screen. My only real gripe with the demon system is that, inevitably, you can end up just sticking to a single more powerful one, particularly the ranged class, who can be used to cheese some of the enemies and bosses in the earlier game. It was only until much later that I was really required to shift characters to survive certain fights. As well as the weapon of the demon you've selected, you can also assign up to 4 of the unlocked skills. They start out pretty mediocre, but end up with some, dare I say it, almost limit break style attacks. The skill tree and implementation are another very strong area, while a few are perhaps a touch overpowered. As you battle, you'll notice a gauge that's constantly filling down in the corner, and that represents your affinity with your demon. When it reaches 100, you can then hold a trigger and unleash the full power of your attacks. Movement and damage increase, and the rhythmic battle music kicks in. This is called manifesting. An interesting mechanic is that while higher affinity offers greater attack, if you go too high, say above 150, then your defense begins to drop, so there is a risk and reward system at play here as well. I mentioned that using a particular demon will level it. There is also a further element called awakenings. If you use a skill a lot, then it may awaken. This will then allow you to add a further element to that skill, increasing its power, speed, or various other effects. I enjoyed that the game rewarded you for finding your favorite setup, and it adds a further level of progression to avoid it becoming stale. Each demon will drastically change the feeling of combat. In much the same way as, say, Monster Hunter, it means that you can keep it quite fresh by simply switching up your characters. Weapons can be found throughout the game or in chests that you'll find in the Beyond. They can be upgraded in towns, where you'll also notice these small slots by them, indicating how many soul stones can be attached. Again, these are naturally earned just by fighting, so by the time you go to upgrade, you'll generally have a large pool to choose from, which will further modify your weapons, adding status effects like poison, stun, and paralysis, to name a few. The point I'm getting here is that combat is quite deep, despite the potentially superficially shallow one-button system. Let's talk about the shifting mechanic, as it also comes into play a great deal during Oninaki. Essentially, at almost any time in the game, you can press the left trigger to shift to the Beyond, the land of the dead. There are many times in the game where you'll be required to do this to speak with deceased characters, but it can also be used to escape combat, as the enemies you were fighting won't potentially be on the other side. What you may find though is a black nothingness, where one touch from an enemy will kill you instantly. To open up these areas, you must kill a more powerful enemy, which then removes this fog of war. What's the point of the Beyond other than simply as a narrative device though? In all honesty, I would say not enough. I often felt like it was simply there to assist the story, but there are still some uses. When you unlock it, you can almost certainly guarantee every area within it will hold a chest, but equally a load more enemies to clear. Thankfully, I enjoyed the combat. Other than that though, the Beyond is underutilized. Despite sometimes being used to show hidden paths, I think they could have done more here. Your progress is saved at these pillars, and this also allows for fast travel and the watching of the aforementioned demon memories. It's also here that you can change and alter your party, or check out the current story information and side quests. These are always helping a lost soul move on through visiting a set location or bringing them an item. They felt a touch underdone. In the one main town, you can move freely about, but there is very little to do. You'll find a vendor who, as mentioned, can upgrade your weapons, but that's really it. They can feel a touch lifeless. While the world map gives the impression of a vast scale, I miss being able to travel at least once in an overworld map. The fast travel shrinks what could have been a grandiose setting down to a series of smaller ones. Your mini-map works well enough for navigation, but the obscure side quest system can make completing those a chore rather than a compelling distraction. Boss fights. Now, it wouldn't be an RPG worth its salt without a good deal of things to fight, and yeah, there are a ton. With at least 60 different types of smaller enemies and many larger ones and bosses, you'll be fighting lots of weird fallen souls along your way. But that being said, large areas may feature a handful of similar enemy types. I enjoyed this. It meant each area required a slightly different combat strategy. Where one was filled with long-range poisonous foes, another was swamped with charging dinosaurs, and this encouraged me to shift from my beloved long-range deer to a more speedy up-close demon. Overall then, I enjoyed Oninaki's gameplay. The controls are excellent and the combat is compelling enough to carry me through the more sluggish sections in the middle of the game. You will gain power quickly, and endgame combat feels suitably strong, with a much boosted affinity cap through weapon mods and a number of skills that heal you while decimating your foes. You'll be knifing through much butter on your way to the end. Death simply returns you to the last save, so it's no real bother. While story should bolster the combat, I felt it worked the other way round with Oninaki, which is a slight concern if that was the element that you were most interested in. Gameplay and controls received 17 out of 20. Visually, this is the most impressive of the 3 games from the Tokyo RPG factory to date. It's more akin to, say, Breath of the Wild at times, but with perhaps a more detailed finish. Not all of it is perfect, although performance is generally solid. There are a few areas that are currently suffering from a touch of lag, although a day 1 patch promises to smooth everything out. Overall, Tokyo RPG Factory present a polished game for the most part. It looks great in docked, again bar a few minor hiccups, and the load times, although a touch on the longer side, only happen once per area. Visuals are quite crisp in handheld as well, which is nice to see. Character design and combat animation are brilliant, especially those demon you collect, and some of the finishing executions at the end of a boss fight have a real anime flair to them. Visuals for me score 16 out of 20. Now audio is a mixed bag in my opinion. I mentioned that the story wasn't quite as impactful at times as it should have been, and for me the audio could be the culprit. While the songs themselves are great, with some lovely classical and orchestrated numbers, juxtaposed with upbeat heart-pumping battle music, the timing is just off. In the same way as when I walked down the aisle with my wife, I didn't play What Is Love. Here you'll hear the same 5 or 6 pieces of wonderful audio, just used in inopportune moments. It just doesn't gel quite right. Add into that during most of the battles in the game, there's absolute silence. It's only when you trigger that manifestation mode that the battle music actually kicks in, which leaves for some very strange silent combat times. Conversely, I found the voice acting to be great. But in a move to potentially avoid distraction, much of the Japanese voice acting outside of the story sections simply isn't subtitled. And with some of the lines of dialogue seemingly quite long and perhaps important, having the option to at least turn this on to know what they were saying would have been nice. Combat audio is decent for the most part, with repetition becoming a slight issue here. With one main attack you'd think you'd get sick to death, but each of the skills you place will generally have a different dialogue attached, and it can come in quite handy during intense fights to be able to rely on those audio cues as to which attack you've used and those which are on cooldown. Still, not having a battle music as standard is a bit odd. When it's on point, the music is lovely, but the jarring impact of misplaced melodies, including the almost eerie track that seems to play randomly, impacts the overall delivery. Still, audio scores 14 out of 20. The game costs £40.49, €44.99 and $44.99 at launch. Now make no mistake, this is a big game. It has its flaws, but there is much to like about Oninaki. The price is high, and that's going to be the deciding factor for many. Is it an absolutely essential day 1 RPG? I'm not sure. To completely finish everything, all the side content and main quests, you're looking at around 50 to 100 hours, but again, this can be rushed through if you want. There's nothing stopping you running past the majority of enemies, but good luck fighting some of the harder bosses. I thoroughly enjoyed the game combat, and for me it was the saving grace. The story is like a roller coaster, ranging from brilliant moments to dragging its heels with some sections that just feel a touch like filler. Overall for me, value scores 14 out of 20. I love that the developers are taking narrative risks with the series, and certainly some of the brutal depictions of life and death in Oninaki make for excellent story fodder. The pacing and delivery leave a touch to be desired, but thankfully the combat and demon backstories are decent. Oninaki scores a Switch Up score of 75%. Thanks so much to Square for the review copy. I hope we've given it a fair and honest reflection. Thank you to our patrons who support us every single month. If you enjoyed the content, then consider subscribing, and for all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch Up. Cheers guys, see ya!